Greetings and welcome to another video for the Criminology class. In this particular video, we are going to talk about classical criminology with a focus on Cesare Beccaria. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So first, let's talk about the people. And some of this is going to be a review of last week, or of the last video rather. So John Locke was an early utilitarian. John Stuart Mill was a later utilitarian. So John Locke was writing roughly around the same time as some of the other Enlightenment philosophers. So Beccaria would have been very well acquainted with Locke's work. Now Mill wrote later than Beccaria, so he would not have been familiar with it. So John Stuart Mill wrote the book, or the essay entitled Utilitarianism, where he defends the theory because it was falling in disfavor. Now, two of the other people that are very important for us to understand are Jeremy Bentham. Now, Jeremy Bentham was a deterrence theorist, and he really focused on the pleasure principle. Now, Bentham was a Brit. So then we come to Cesare Beccaria. Now, Cesare Beccaria is the father of deterrence theory, even though there were other theorists, such as Jeremy Bentham. Beccaria is really the father of deterrence theory, or what I call philosophic criminology. He espoused the understanding of utilitarianism. He espoused Locke's pleasure principle as well as Bentham's, as well as the way that Bentham did. But it's very important to understand that Beccaria is very important as kind of the father of modern criminology. Now, I've got Charles Dickens up here. And you might be saying, but Charles Dickens was a novelist. He wrote fiction. Well, he also wrote nonfiction. In fact, American Notes is a work of nonfiction. The chapter on Philadelphia and its solitary prison is required reading from me when I teach any class on corrections. But Charles Dickens was an anti-utilitarian. Now, the utilitarians, they appealed to the selfish sense of a human being. In other words, we're going to develop our policies to appeal to this selfish sense where you want to increase your pleasure, decrease your pain. And so human beings are very selfish, and we have to coax them in to doing the right thing by our policies. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we get to Cesare Beccaria here in a minute. But Dickens didn't like that idea. Now, a lot of folks don't realize that Dickens was a highly religious man. Wasn't necessarily written into his novels about how much of a Christian he was, but the Christian themes abound. Perhaps A Christmas Carol is the story that best illustrates his disdain for utilitarianism. Scrooge is a utilitarian. Scrooge is there to increase his own pleasure with his money, to decrease his pain by not losing any more money, by gaining more money, by foreclosing on orphans at Christmas time, because that's what makes him feel good. The idea that it is important to pass laws so that we can motivate people like Scrooge to do the right thing was distasteful to Dickens, to say the least. So in the novel, the novella, A Christmas Carol, and I'm sure that the folks watching this video have seen some version of it in film or TV, I recommend that you actually go back and read the actual novella. But in the novella, Dickens fills the story with characters that do the right thing simply because it's the right thing to do. Now, a utilitarian might come back in and say, well, it makes them feel good to know they're doing the right thing, so it still is about their pleasure. Well, that's what we call circular reasoning. In other words, the utilitarian is always going to be able to say that everything fits utilitarian theory. If something always fits the theory, then it is not logically sound. If everything that happens can be explained by the theory, then it is not logically sound. I just wanted to put Dickens in here so that you will understand that even while utilitarianism was very popular, there were still those who disagreed, and Dickens was one of them. I am not certain, but I wonder if John Stuart Mill had read Dickens and in his essay Utilitarianism was trying to give a rebuttal to Dickens. Okay, so, don't know how that slide got in there? We can skip it. All right, so let's talk about Marchese Beccaria Cesare Bonasson. He was born in 1738 and he died in 1794. If you didn't notice, that made him 56 years old. He was not an old man when he died. But there you see Cesare Beccaria. So there he is. So let's kind of look at him as a person. So he was born into the Habsburg family, very well-known family in Italy, but he was described his primary education at a Jesuit school as fanatical and not conducive to, quote, the development of human emotions. Now remember, this is the middle of the Enlightenment, and Beccaria is considered a philosopher, and philosophers, especially in the 1700s, did not give much attention to emotion. So it's interesting that that's the way he said it. But it's important to understand he was a lawyer. He got a law degree from the University of Pavia in 1758. So he was 20 years old. That was it. He was just 20 years old, very young. Now, he had significant mood swings that are consistent with what today we know to be bipolar disorder. So there is a strong possibility that he had bipolar disorder. Now, along with some of his friends, he founded an intellectual society called the Academy of Fists. Now, he first published an essay on economics, and that was entitled On Remedies for the Monetary Disorder of Milan in the year 1762. Now, what is important to know is that modern economists use deterrence theory, deterrence theory or rational choice theory is the modern version of it that's updated, which we'll talk about later. But they use rational choice theory built on Beccaria's work when they deal with economics today. Now, he was significantly depressed at the time of his death, and this was predominantly related to the atrocities that he saw happening in the French Revolution. Now, the other thing to remember about Beccaria is that he was a very well-known party animal. He loved to party. Now, does he not look like a party animal? Now, believe it or not, some of the images you've seen of him in this slideshow, in this slide deck, for his time, he would have looked like a party animal because they all dressed, everybody pretty much dressed the same back in those days. It would have been hard to distinguish that by costume. But he wrote a book called On Crimes and Punishments. Now, I actually have a copy of that book. So you see the cover of it there. Okay, here is the book here. And if you can look at the little video of me in the corner, the little box that's got me in it, you can see that this is a very thin book. It's 116 pages. The line spacing is a lot greater than most, but it's just a really easy read, actually. So even though I don't make you read the whole thing, I encourage you to do so. Okay, so you see an original English version published in Edinburgh in 1807 as well. So this is when it was um, 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 translated into English, and you can see that there is a commentary attributed to Voltaire in that particular version. Okay, so underlying principles of deterrence theory, a la Beccaria. The pain-pleasure principle. That is, people choose behaviors based on how much pleasure it will give them. Now contrast this to the poem, The Road Not Taken. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Now that poem is about someone who is taking the more difficult, the more painful road because they believe they're going to learn from it. Now keep in mind, The Road Not Taken, Robert Frost, okay, roughly 150 years later, if we're rounding to the nearest 50th year. But the idea that the pain-pleasure principle was not just stuck with Charles Dickens. All right, so deterrence. People avoid pleasurable acts if the pain or fear of punishment is significant enough. In other words, if we can get them to believe that the crime isn't worth it or that the crime doesn't pay. You ever heard that phrase? Okay. So he believed that the government was too harsh on criminals, and he actually advocated for offenders to be treated with care and dignity. Now, what's interesting, before we get there, is that Beccaria believed that in order for deterrence, for people to be deterred from committing crime, they had to be able to know what was a crime. He advocated for the enshrinement of criminal law in formalized codes. Because even though many nations at the time had some formal criminal codes, there was also the reality that the monarch could punish anyone in any way they wanted for any reason that they wanted. And Beccaria thought this was just completely untenable. He believed it was a violation of human rights. So he began to write his essay because he wanted to make the criminal justice system and the punishment of offenders more humane by reducing the number of people who needed to be punished, by preventing crime, by writing laws that would convince people it doesn't pay to commit the crime, so they make the rational choice not to commit the crime. Okay? Now, there is another underlying principle, and that is that every human being will commit crimes unless we have a reason not to. Now, Beccaria also believed in free will. Remember that free will versus determinism. Beccaria believed in free will, so we need to understand that as well. So there are three premises of deterrence theory, according to Beccaria. The first one is certainty of detection and punishment. Crimes are more effectually prevented by the certainty and severity than the severity of the punishment. And we're going to get to the severity here in just a minute, but he believed that if we could convince people by the way that we do things in the criminal justice system, if they would believe, if we could get them to believe that they were certain to be detected and certain to be punished, that we could do some of the work of preventing criminal behavior. So the certainty of detection and punishment. Now, some people will say certainty of detection, but he meant certainty of detection and punishment. Okay, so, all right. Swiftness of punishment. So how quickly is a person going to be punished? In other words, how close to the punishment or the crime does the punishment occur? Now, I want you to notice the first bullet point here, behavioral psychology in the relational frame. Now, the reason I put this here is because in modern behavioral psychology, when we talk about relational frame, we mean that mental work that we do, that work we do in our brain, where we put things in a frame that we see as relating to each other, as being in a relationship. So, for instance, if I view the school where I teach as my home, then I'm going to put home and the name of my school in a relational frame together, right? The school isn't actually my home. My home is off campus, but I put them in a relational frame. So people that know my wife Tina and I, they tend to they just know us together. They don't know us not being married. And so in their minds, they relate the two of us together. You might do that with your parents, or you might have grown up in a home where your parents were emotionally cut off from each other and didn't spend much time with each other at all. So you might have maybe your mother and her parents in a relational frame. One more example from my work doing therapy, I have done a lot of therapy with women who were molested as a child by their father or an uncle or a grandfather way back in the 1950s. So they would have been born in the 40s. Many of them were the baby boomers that were born after World War II. And then as we get into the 1950s, they start to be molested. These children start to be molested by either their father, an uncle, sometimes a grandfather. It might be someone else in the neighborhood. But the number of these women that I worked with who said that they cannot stand the smell of Old Spice cologne because that's what their perpetrator wore. What they are doing is they are putting their own molestation in a relational frame with Old Spice cologne so that anybody who wears Old Spice cologne is automatically seen in their brain as being a child molester. Okay? That's a relational frame. So, Beccaria is basically saying if we can get the would-be criminal to put in a relational frame, I commit this crime, I get this punishment, and that happens by putting them together. So that's what Beccaria is trying to say. Now, by the way, the right to a speedy trial in the U.S., many believe, came from this particular principle of Beccaria. So in the U.S., we have a lengthy criminal court process, which basically means we really can't research the swiftness of punishment because people don't get swiftly punished in the U.S. It just doesn't happen. Okay, and then the last one is the punishment fitting the crime. Now, Beccaria believed that the punishment should exceed the benefits of the crime to the point where the person will believe that crime doesn't pay, but it can't go much more beyond that. So from a behavioral perspective, rewarding desired behavior is more effective than punishing undesired behavior. In Beccaria, even though he didn't quite say that, it seems as though he was beginning to stumble upon that particular concept. Now, Beccaria despised the death penalty and says it should only be used in very rare occasions. Okay, now there are also two different types of deterrence according to Picardian. So there's general deterrence. That's where an individual sees other people punished, they get caught, they get punished, and that punishment fits the crime. And so by me seeing somebody else go through that, I don't want to commit crime because I don't want to go through that. That's called general deterrence. Specific deterrence is the idea that if I do something, if I commit a crime and then I get caught and I get punished, I won't want to commit a crime anymore. So specific deterrence is about catching me, punishing me so I won't do it again. Whereas general deterrence is about letting other people know that criminals are getting caught and punished so they won't want to do it either in the first place. Now, at the bottom, you see a nice little cartoon. They say that capital punishment isn't a deterrent to crime, and that is actually true. One of the things that we know is that states that have capital punishment tend to have higher rates of murder. But then the king says, well, tell that to him. Well, of course, it's going to deter him because you kill him, he can't commit any more crimes, right? Okay. But it's not going to affect general deterrence. By the way, this isn't deterrence, this is complete incapacitation. Okay. So Beccavia's goal was, it's interesting to note that he initially published his work anonymously because it actually criticized the Italian criminal justice system of his time. He didn't want to get in trouble. And he did believe that his theories would bring a more humane approach to the policy of criminal justice administration. Now, we've already talked about the death penalty, but there's a quote here. I just want to read it. The death penalty cannot be useful because of the example of barbarity it gives men. In other words, if we use the death penalty, we're not deterring other men, we're showing them how to be barbaric. Okay, we're giving them an example of how to be barbaric. Okay, so research support. Certainty of punishment appears most effective per the full body of research, but it has not been enhanced in CJ policy and law. In other words, how in the world can you increase the ability to convince that person that they're certainly going to be punished? Now, keep in mind, we're not talking about actual certainty of getting punished. We're talking about the perception of the would-be offender. Swiftness of punishment promises to be the most effective, but this has not been studied in recent times because we don't have swift punishment in the American criminal justice system. Cases linger and linger, and then more severe punishments do not appear to provide general deterrence. So the three strikes laws don't really help. Okay, they incapacitate, but they do not deter. Okay, so I wanted to show this last slide to talk about a few things. First, there's a film called Double Indemnity. It was directed by Billy Wilder. It's got Fred McMurray, Barbara Stanwyck, and Edward G. Robinson, three very well-known actors. Fred McMurray was in My Three Sons back in the 1960s. Barbara Stanwyck was in Oh My Lands. I can't remember the name of the TV show that she was in. Edward G. Robinson was in a lot of movies as well. In fact, the last thing he did was Soylent Green before he died of cancer. But this was a very well-known film. It still is studied in film school, but Double Indemnity. If you are taking this class online, then I recommend that you watch it. If you're taking it in the classroom with me, you're going to be watching it anyway. Now, on the right-hand side is a screenshot from the original Scared Straight broadcast of 60 Minutes back in the late 70s, early 80s. I can't remember the exact date. Scared Straight, three strikes laws, all those are both deterrence theory policies that were developed. If we convince a person that if they get a third conviction, then they're going to have a life sentence in prison, then they'll stop committing crime. No, three strikes laws don't work. Knowing that's going to happen does not deter people from committing more crimes. But Scared Straight was a program where these teenagers had committed acts of juvenile delinquency, so they were getting in trouble with the law. They were brought into this prison where all these hardened criminals got in their face and yelled at them. But here's the thing. There were other juvenile delinquents that at the time that did not go through a Scared Straight program. When I believe it was when they were 25 years old, they followed up to see if they had fewer or more crimes than that control group. So you've got the two groups: those who did Scared Straight program, those who did not. Both have a history of juvenile delinquency, and their histories were pretty matched. In other words, they had similar histories. The two groups did. The group that went through Scared Straight actually was more likely to have an adult criminal record by the age of 25. I believe it's 25. I can't remember the exact year. But they were more likely to have a criminal record, an adult criminal record, if they went through Scared Straight. Which might mean that Beccaria's idea about the death penalty, that all it does is give an example of barbarity, all that might have happened is that these juveniles that went through Scared Straight were having prison normalized for them and were being given an example of barbarity, that all it did was make them worse rather than scared. In other words, maybe it didn't scare them straight as much as it influenced their behavior, which, by the way, that's going to be another theory, social control theory. There are a lot of other social psychological theories that could explain why that is, that we will discuss later in the semester. I'm going to stop the screen share, and I know this has been a little bit longer of a video. I hope that this information is interesting to you. Anytime I can hear the backgrounds of things, it really makes things a lot more interesting for me. I love knowing the history and how things got to where they were. But believe me, what I gave here is a very oversimplified version. This is an undergraduate course where we are going to survey all of the theories. Well, there will be a few that we miss, granted, but we are going to survey numerous theories. So I'm having to oversimplify, or we would go on with these videos for hours and hours and hours. I will see you next video.